Hey everybody, welcome back to the landscape photography series. Today I'm going to walk you through the best camera settings for capturing beautiful landscape photos. These settings will help you get those sharp, detailed shots with perfect exposures. Okay, now before I dive into that, I don't use any of these settings, okay? I'm just informing you. The only setting that I use and the only one I will ever use is manual, and that's the only one I know how to use. These other ones are just stepping stones to help you get up to manual. So let's get into it. First, let's talk about shooting modes. For landscape, I highly recommend switching, if you don't understand manual yet, to Aperture Priority, which is either going to be the A or AV on your camera. This lets you control the aperture while the camera handles your shutter speed. It is perfect for making sure everything in your shot from the foreground to your background is in focus. Well, speaking of aperture, for most landscape you will want to use a small aperture. A small aperture is flip-flopped, right? For example, a small aperture is going to be something like f8 to f16. This gives you a deeper depth of field, meaning more of your scene is going to be sharp. Now, a large aperture is going to be like f4, f2, right? Think of your camera like your eye. Your aperture correlates with your pupil. So when you're using a large or a small aperture, that hole is going to get really, really small on your camera, right? So it's going to limit the light that comes in. And granted, this is all important to know, okay? Next up is your ISO. Keep it as low as possible. I keep my ISO on my Canon at ISO 50. There's occasionally I'll bring it up to 400 to 800 depending on what I'm doing because I need to increase my shutter speed, but this will be an overview. When we get into the exposure triangle, you'll understand a little bit more. But you want to try and keep your ISO as low as possible. Most people try and keep it around 100 or 200. A low ISO will reduce the noise and keep your image crisp and clean, especially in daylight conditions. Now granted, when we get into astro and stuff like that, we're going to push our ISO because we need that. Your ISO, think of it as sensitive to light. Your eye is sensitive to light. If you ever had an eye doctor's appointment and they dilate your eyes and you go out and you take off the glasses, your eyes are really sensitive to the sun. The same thing with your camera. When you increase that, your sensor is being more sensitive to light. Now granted, a higher ISO is going to create noise and hot pixels. Now granted, this is something we'll talk later down the road, but we're just talking about basic camera settings, okay? We're talking about that and we'll get in more depth of that later. For sharp landscapes, you also want to pay attention to your shutter speed. If you're shooting handheld, well, you want to make sure it's shooting a fast enough to avoid camera shake. Camera shake usually starts at 1/100th of a second or faster. But if you're using a tripod, which I highly recommend, you can go to a slower to 1/50th or 1/25 of a second, especially at sunrise or sunset. Okay, one of the things that I use is a tripod, and I use a remote release shutter or a 2-second timer to avoid shaking in the camera. If I don't have my remote, I set it in the camera for a 2-second delay. I push my button, I release it, I let go, I step back, and it goes 1 1 1 1 2 2 2 2, and then it takes said photo. Now that's something you can do to help avoid camera shaking. Now you're thinking, well, is it making that big of a difference? It does. When you take 100 photos and you stack them handheld and then you line them up, you're going to notice that they're not going to line up, and generally you're going to be off by 4 or 5 pixels. Well, a pixel is something we'll talk about later, okay? Lastly, the biggest thing you need to shoot in is considered to be shooting in RAW format. RAW versus JPEG, right? A RAW format is going to give you the most flexibility in post-processing. So you can adjust the exposure, the colors, the detail layers without losing photo quality because it's in a RAW. So let's sit down, let's talk about it. To sum up everything we've talked about, you want to use aperture priority mode on your camera between f8 and f16. You want to keep your ISO as low as possible. You want to use a tripod when possible and shooting in RAW format. Okay, this is what's going to give you the best results starting out. As we move into more technical and progressive within the photography, especially for example when we start talking about the exposure triangle and shooting in manual, you'll understand a lot of this stuff. But that is it for today's video. With these settings, you'll be ready to capture stunning landscape shots in no time. Thanks for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe. Have a good day, my friends.